Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another session of the Belong Book Club. Before we begin, just a little bit about Belong. So, Belong seeks to bring services and community experiences to people who otherwise face bias and prejudice for reasons of identity. So, that can be gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, caste, religion, ability, etc. And a part of that, we have, we have a lot of things as part of it, really. It's more of an umbrella organization that has this book club, but also has a research collective, a mental health collective, and an inclusive housing program. But what the book club in particular does, which is what all of you are here for today, is that it features, or what we're doing right now really to make lemonade out of lemons, is we're hosting online literary events with authors who write on themes of identity, diversity, and inclusion. So that we can keep these conversations going even while we're all, I guess, socially distanced from each other. And yeah, so before I begin, just to say a little bit about the format of the session. So we are going to, so I'll begin by introducing Ria, of course, and then Ria is going to say a little bit about her book and read an excerpt that she selected from her book. After which I'll ask her a couple of questions just to get the conversation going. And then, of course, all of you are free to ask her your questions. So use the Q&A box below to send them to me, and I'll keep weaving them into our conversation. Like I said earlier, if you have anything to communicate with us, you can use chat as well. And yeah, let's get started. So I'm going to introduce Ria very quickly, even though I assume all of you know a little bit about her already since you're here. But Ria Mukherjee is a Bangalore-based writer who thinks at the intersection of gender, sexuality, mental health, and social justice. Her book, The Body Myth, was published by Penguin Random House India in 2019 and won the Tata Literature Live First Book Award. She also co-founded the Bangalore Writers Workshop in 2012 and currently co-runs Write Leela Write, a design and content laboratory. So that's a little bit about Ria. Ria, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Manjari, for having me. And I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, everyone who showed up over here. I'm really, really grateful for this experience. So I'm going to begin with, I guess, what is the most standard thing with when you talk about your book is a small little reading. And I won't bore you for too long. It'll just be 5 minutes. Just to set a little context for those of you who don't know, my novel, The Body Myth, I started writing in the end of 2016. And it got published last year in 2019, in the beginning of 2019, in the US first by Unnamed Press. And then it was published by Penguin India later that year. So the book, and I, my elevator pitch on the book is, it's about this young widow who is obviously coping through massive amounts of grief. And she meets this extraordinary yet chronically ill woman, Sarah, and her husband, Rahul, and inexplicably falls into this weird obsessive relationship with them. And that's just the tiny gist of the book. And I'm going to read something from right from the beginning of the book, almost the starting. And this is where Meera, the widow, the young widow, she's just barely 30, and she witnesses meets Sarah under a very unusual circumstance, and this is her meeting the main protagonist meeting a person who's going to be central to this book. Mm-hmm. The first time I saw Sarah, the woman was sitting on a park in West Point Gardens, where I came every Sunday for a 5-kilometer walk. She couldn't see me, but I had stopped mid-stride to stare at her. I looked at her for 3 reasons. Number 1, her face was twisted in contemplation. Number 2, she was wearing a beige kurta and a transparent golden dupatta. And 3, she was fucking gorgeous. I am a woman who takes great pleasure in noticing other women, in raw appreciation of our sex, but also as a comparative study. I could not, however, take the time to assess her beauty. She was onto something strange. Her head darted behind and to the side. I was sure she was checking to see if anyone was looking at her. She was in the center of a vast bamboo garden. No one else was around. I was in the corner, out of her view. She looked back to the center, her facial muscles tweaked with confidence. She took a few deep breaths and started to tremble. I saw a man, white shirt, beige pants, thick hair, walking toward her. Suddenly, she began shaking violently, falling off the bench, saliva pouring out from her mouth. As she fell, the man broke into a trot, and I found myself jogging toward her too. Don't put anything into her mouth. Let her be, he said firmly, before I had even reached them. I froze, holding my hands up in the air. He kneeled beside her and soothed her with his voice. It's going to be over soon, Sarah. You've got this. It's going to be over soon. She seemed to stabilize, her body stilled, her face relaxed. He scooped her up, pushed her hand back, took her dupatta, and wiped her mouth. Then he looked at me. Thank you for your concern. She has seizures sometimes. A man had never appeared so authentic to me. It made my heart flare up with an unseasoned emotion, a longing to hold his hand. Perhaps his authenticity was all the more palpable because of the inauthenticity of her seizure. None of it, I was beginning to realize, seemed real. Hey, I'm okay, the woman croaked. She stroked the man's face and looked toward me. This is so embarrassing. She sat up almost athletically and recrossed her legs on the bench. I'm Sarah, and you are? Mira, do you need to go to a hospital? No, she just needs to get back up on her medication, the man said with a hint of irritation, a dash of affection. I hate taking it every day. If you saw me and my med routine, you'd think I was 84, not 29. His name was Rahul, and Sarah was his wife. They'd been married 7 years and had met in college. They didn't seem shy, but I felt that there was only a certain number of questions they would answer, so I stopped. For a second or two, there was silence. We heard a bird coo. We heard the feet of other walkers shuffle behind us. Rahul sat down by me on the mud, craning our heads and looking up to Sarah. Rahul reached toward me and dusted speckles of mud from my sneakers. I couldn't remember the last time someone had touched me with absent-minded affection. Sarah looked down at my sneakers. I love the blue laces. Cool, Rahul confirmed, as he pulled one of my laces out and then proceeded to tie it back. I wanted to giggle. A grown man and a woman amused with my sneakers in the middle of a park. A couple willing to Sunday socialize minutes after a medical emergency. I looked at Sarah, trying to discern what had happened. Was she really okay? Why didn't she want to go to a hospital? And had she in fact started the seizure only after she made sure Rahul had appeared in the park? Sarah put her hand on Rahul's head, ruffled his thick black hair, and asked him for some more water. He pulled out an orange bottle from his backpack and handed it over. From her purse, she pulled out a card of pills trapped in plastic bubbles. She popped a couple out of the foil, flipped them in her mouth, took a swig of water, and then immediately turned to me. So what do you do? It was one of those questions I couldn't begin to answer. It was also one of those questions that I had a very simple answer to. I teach English at Seven Seeds. So it was international school, Sarah asked. Her mouth moved like she was tasting the ghost of the pills she had just taken. Yeah, I said. My voice trailed as I saw Rahul looking at me, deeply, endearingly. Sarah's eyes were right back on me. She seemed so present in the moment, and it made me uncomfortable. We live close by. Come. We rarely have people over. Her voice was syrupy sweet, like an adolescent talking to her bestie in high school. But don't you need to go to your doctor? You just lost consciousness. My question quivered, but retained authority. Testing her, testing myself. Her face didn't flinch. Oh, but it happens all the time. I know what to do. I need a change in medication. I'll see my doctor tomorrow. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Great. So thanks so much for reading that. And if you're good with it, I'd like to just sort of launch into some of my questions to help tease out some of the main themes that you explore in this novel. And of course, our participants are more than welcome to send in their questions using the Q&A button below as something strikes them. So I wanted to begin by thinking a little around what is the central theme and also the title of your book, The Body Myth, right? And one of the things that it engages is our ready belief in the Descartesian notion of the mind-body split, right? That the two are separate. And so then how we think about pain is that pain is either exclusively about the body or exclusively about the mind. And funnily enough, my grandmother is one of the rare few people who believes in the latter, because anytime I would have like a fever or a headache when I was young, she would be like, okay, how are you feeling? Her first response was, how are you doing, right? But even that, to my mind, was a perspective that made me feel like somehow my body was being invalidated. And so you certainly bring a kind of psychosomatic perspective that talks about the deep and complex relationship between the mind and the body in this novel. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about why it was important for you to so of course a little bit about what this perspective is, more than what I might have already said, and B, why is it sort of important for you to bring that perspective by way of this novel?
I mean, this is such a great question, and I might, my answer is going to be a little all over the place, because when I was writing this book, I was actually going through a philosophical and almost like a spiritual kind of understanding of who I was, what humanity is. And what your grandmother said is really interesting, because I feel like now in the modern rhetoric of medical science and psychology, and even in spirituality and all of these other unknown facets about the human condition and how the mind and consciousness works, this is coming to the forefront. It's about how you feel, how you're emotionally doing, and how your body can even hide trauma or exhibit trauma in physical symptoms. And these are discussions that are happening now, and I guess it gets it's kind of all over the place, and it really depends on how open your mind is and how you want to kind of digest that information. Within scientific binaries, are you opening up your head to the unknown and to the unexplored things that don't sound too credible, especially when it's has to be peer reviewed or has to come from certain journals, and so then how do you make sense of it, and then where does lived experience kind of fit into the grand puzzle? So I think that's something that I was really kind of looking at. I'm a person who also suffers from chronic depression. I have been on medication for years for it, but also somebody who can understand that it's a lot about how I'm feeling. I also suffer from migraines, which for me is a source of chronic pain. And I have noticed that stress, and now stress is such an all-encompassing word, but stress in terms of my mental well-being, how I'm feeling, how zen I'm feeling, really affects the intensity of the pain, the frequency of the pain. But this is just, again, my lived experience. But things that I was really interested in kind of discussing through my book. And I think so that, that's the short answer to, why that.
Right. So Vikrant actually asked a question that speaks to your answer a little bit. So I just want to read it out. Vikrant says, hi, which personal experiences did you specifically draw from to write on such complex relationships between individuals, as well as one's own body and mind? Do you consider any specific journey of yours as a creative muse to this book? So if there's any other sort of sense in which you may have drawn on your own personal, I guess, journey.
Very much in terms of making sense of the world. A lot of unlearning about, I was somebody who grew up in a schooling system that really didn't work with what I feel are my skills in the world. And I was, I think when you look at the schooling system that we have, we are taught to unquestion, to respond to authority, whatever the authority is, as long as somebody says there's authority on it, you respond to that. And I feel like that can take a generation to actually unlearn, or it can take a decade of trying to unlearn and see who you really are. And if you look at, my interpretation of my own book, because now readers can have their own interpretation, but my interpretation of this own book is actually going down to the foundation of who are you, and can you celebrate you for who you are? despite all of these other learnings that you've had, socializations that you've had, and even after unlearning some of those socializations, you may still choose to go back to something that you grew up with. Because if you look at Meera in this book, she is someone who tries to validate her existence with intellectualism, with the fact that she's read a lot. And somewhere in the book, you'll realize that she's actually a really simple person who has very simple desires and what she wants. But somehow the insecurity and the grief that she's gone through has made her use intellectualism as a coping mechanism. At least that's the way I saw it when I was writing her. And obviously these things come from my own observations of the world, and how people, including me, need to validate ourselves through something. It's always through something, whether it's, oh, you're the nice person, so therefore I always have to be the nice person in order to validate myself. So whatever behaviors, we kind of take it, there is this notion of how are we trying to make ourselves happy or feel, validated in the world.
Yeah, and I wanted to actually take the liberty of quoting something that you write. So this is Meera talking about her coping mechanism. So Meera, who is the protagonist and narrator, she is obsessed with the French existentialists. And initially, I just thought it was such a bizarre choice in some sense. And initially I was like, God, this sounds pretentious. Not that your writing sounds pretentious, but is Meera, perhaps Meera is coming off as pretentious. But it becomes clear in this passage that it's just her way of dealing with that grief in some sense. So she says, you might think it was teaching that saved me from the blunt darkness that comes with the loss of a spouse. It was not. I almost committed suicide, true, but it was Camus, Sartre, Foucault, and de Beauvoir who led me back to life. These philosophers who embraced the absurd made my pain feel silly. It made the world seem indulgent and, most of all, purposeless. And so that's one of the passages where I think what you were saying really sort of comes through. So do you have anything to add on that? Otherwise, I can move on to my next question.
Yeah, definitely, because I feel like there is a pretentious nature to the way Meera, actually advocates for her knowledge, especially with her relationship with Sarah, because Sarah is more spiritual, she's more whimsical in her approach. And so therefore, Meera always feels like I need to have this intellectual authority over her. But I feel like a lot of things can happen to us personally where it might not make sense in terms of what heals us. Something really absurd can heal us. And it is just what it is, And for Meera, it was the fact that she was in a home for a while because she had a mental breakdown after the loss of her husband, and she happened to chance upon these books, and that's the way she went, or she associates her time of healing or her time of distraction rather with the French existentialists.
Right. Okay, so I want to move on to another really prominent theme in your book, and it also aligns with some of what Belong is trying to do or explore through the conversations it's engaging in. But so this is a question about, so the two women protagonists in your novel, Meera and Sarah, they both carry their trauma around, and in some sense it is their trauma that is the center of the novel, is the plot of the novel in some sense. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you perceive as that intersection between gender and mental health, and I guess what is your understanding of women's pain?
I think from I was first brought to attention of the idea of women's pain and how it's always been kind of marginalized and very different, first through some Western literature, and then I see it has a whole different kind of applicability, if you're talking from the Indian context as well, because there are other intersections of oppression going on here as well. And then every culture has infuses patriarchy in very different ways, and when you're talking about a country like India, it's completely it's really, really diverse. But I feel like, in general, if I have to make a more macro kind of comment on this, women have always, first of all, been told that this is what happens as a woman to you. So therefore, you're already automatically trained that there is going to be a certain amount of struggle and physical pain that you will have to bear. I remember growing up, and I think 3 or 4, older women at some point always told me that, oh, but anyway, what is this? You're going to have to bear a child one day, then you wait. So that kind of pain, So a lot of your pain is always invalidated through the fact that you are a woman, and as a woman, you are meant to do a certain number of things. And so, and then the quietness of it, or rather what is called as the strength, right? Because why are we glorified as, oh, women are so strong? And we're so strong because we have been socialized to keep quiet about the mental and physical bandwidths we're supposed to take. And this happens on many levels. The easiest level is obviously, menstrual pain that so many, women go through, but is not something that it's just, take a, hey, like even your doctor relationship, depending on what doctor you're talking to, they're going to either say that, well, that's what happens. And of course, I've had great experiences too. I'm not trying to like make blanket statements here. Obviously, there are a lot of this conversation is really evolving and coming to the forefront right now, at least within our privileged circles. But when you look at mental health now, that that starts to really complicate a lot of things. And now you have issues of class and caste and poverty and all of these things. On the internet, I feel we have inherited a certain Western model of talking about mental health, and that becomes a very slippery slope, because it's very easy to lose the entire cultural context of mental health via just one rhetoric of what mental health is as a hashtag, and how we talk about it as a hashtag. It is very healing. It is very therapeutic. It is definitely a tool in talking about it, but it also diminishes a lot of other lived experiences and ways that we could possibly find different solutions. Because the problem is, when we start talking about something, our imagination of it starts to get limited by the template that we've inherited it from. And so I feel like this is something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of mental health. And I feel like we are just getting started on that. I think it's still on a large scale, it's still a very taboo subject. Nobody is really even people from very open and privileged backgrounds are still very hesitant to talk about it. It's something that is, and if you're a woman, it's either, it goes back to the whole notion of hysteria, that how in the Victorian age, women were, who had mental health issues were dismissed as having melancholy or whatever, like just problems with nerves. They just need to rest. They need to be shut out. They need to rest. And this fragility of treating them like, so either they're these strong women who can take anything, or they're these fragile things that need to be shut away.
Mm-hmm. And that the shutting away is in large part of not just the mechanism of control, but that control feeds back into creating some of those mental health issues, right?
Absolutely.
And there's actually a lovely short story that I'd like to recommend to everyone at this point in time. I don't know if you read it, Ria, but it's called The Yellow Wall.
Yeah, that was The Yellow Wall was definitely one of those stories that really made me rethink women mental health on so many other levels.
So, yeah, I'm gonna take the liberty to send the name of that on the chat very soon. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what you said with regard to that a lot of the language that we have of around mental health at the moment has been inherited from the West, and B, that sometimes us assuming those templates limits what we consider the realm of understanding and possibility as a result of understanding. And certainly your novel has a really interesting relationship with labels, because so Sarah, we know, is this chronically ill woman, has a range of symptoms from seizures to headaches to fevers. I'm not even sure. There's just a lot of different things that go on with her, and she's been going to the doctor for years, but she has no idea what it is. And so her illness doesn't have a name. And similarly, the relationship that Sarah has with Rahil, of course, her husband, but also Meera, the three of them, their relationship does not have a name either, because of course it's been described in the media as, a novel about polyamory, right? And that's the label that's been ascribed to it for the sake of understanding. But you nowhere use that term to describe what that relationship is. So my question was about labels, I think, broadly, and what do labels do or don't do for the process of both writing and healing?
So it's really funny you mentioned when the book came out, it was the first few hashtags I saw, like on Instagram now, since a lot of book, news comes out on Instagram. It was hashtagged under polyamory a lot, and I was like, wow, it surprised me as well. I'm just like, oh, it's fine. And then I thought about it, and I was like, well, I guess the entire book is by definition polyamory. There's nothing more to it. But when I was writing the book, it wasn't I wasn't thinking about the label, because when the label comes, then there's a lot of other notions and check boxes that I feel like you have to kind of somehow figure out in order to write it. And to be honest, when I was writing this book, I feel like this was more of a response to grief. And what happens when a profound change happens in your life, right? Especially because the human mind is set up for expectations. So basically, you generally expect the next day to come. You generally expect to be fed the next day. You expect to go to work. You expect these small things, right? And that's what kind of gives us peace of mind. And so when something is completely ruptured, like the death of a spouse, for example, and there are things that could be much worse or much less, but when something is completely ripped out of your life like that, it gives you this moment where you're out of your technically your mind, because everything that your mind wants to feel in control by these expectations. And when it's ripped out of that, you have nothing but this present moment to kind of deal with it and say, oh, fuck, like here we are. And it's in that moment, I feel, that humans have the potential to really deconstruct a lot of the things that they thought were normal, or just fall into things that don't, which can be toxic and which can be healthy, whatever, I mean, depending on the situation. But when you're in that moment of grief, nothing else matters. So a lot of the conditioning and socialization and your morality and your ideas of ethics and right and wrong become very blurry. You're just falling into something that feels good, or you're trying to respond into something that feels good. And so polyamory was a natural result of Mira's grief. And in doing so, she found herself in, or at least, made a new imagination of what her life could be. So I feel there's something very powerful in grief, because the grief rids you of this whole, dichotomy that you have of the mind, that, it's yes or no, black or white. It rids you of that, and it allows you to be more fluid. And so labels are important, when you're talking about sexuality, mental health, identity. And I'll tell you that they're important as long as you can be aware that if you get stuck on the notions of labels themselves, nothing is going to change. All right. So I was saying, like, that's how labels are important. But if they, if you're going to get caught up just in those tick boxes, then it's going to be as dangerous.
Okay, great. So I'm going to now take another audience question. This is from Rohini. Rohini says, hi, Riya. I love your book. Something I think we don't talk about enough is the trauma and rigidity of urban living and the codification of life, religion, and spirituality in that space. In your simulated city, so the simulated city in Riya's book is Suryam, we see Sarah suffer for something, and her somewhat defined Sufic spirituality is her defense against the world and even against her lovers. I'd like to know more about your thoughts on the concrete jungle and our boxed-in souls.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think because, right now, especially people living in, from the middle class and upper middle class lens of urban India, we're living in a place where these labels are really kind of making us take certain camps. And when you take a certain idea of your understanding of this world, you are expected to, maybe not talk about certain things. So, even if you're talking about your politics, people make assumptions about your spiritual beliefs or your religious affiliations. If you talk about your religion or spiritual affiliations, then people make assumptions about your logical reasoning or your politics, right? So, and I feel like these are this has been a constant struggle for me, because I feel like if you're talking about one certain thing, I mean, especially when you're talking about your sense of spirituality, and then trying to talk about that in context to mental health, and then and your beliefs in your politics, is something that is really stifling, and it's hard. But I feel like and this is why it goes back to the notion of sometimes unlabeling yourself so that you can be fluid. And I keep going back to this word fluid, and it helps me a lot even when I'm writing or when I'm sharing something, to just remember that if you can be fluid, then you kind of you give permission to yourself to be however rational or irrational you need to be in that moment.
Right. Yeah, and that certainly speaks to the moment at which so Meera has been sort of in your novel at this, I don't know what to call it, but she's basically been put in a, I guess, mental health institution by her family after her husband dies. And at some point after reading all of these French existentialists, she, like we discussed earlier, just recognizes in some sense the absurdity of life and wants to live it. And she walks out of the gate sort of without anybody's permission. And at that moment, I mean, there's something to the effect of how when you see somebody who's really sort of living their life, all of these other things, all these notions of perhaps urban middle class propriety, notions of what it means to be sane, notions of what it means to have a normal relationship, what it means to I guess just be alive, all of those notions fall away in some sense. So that definitely came across very strongly in your novel as well.
I'm glad, because that was something that I was hoping to kind of corner on, that kind of revelation. Yeah.
Great. So before I move on to my next question, I just want to tell the audience once again that you can use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screens to ask Riya your questions. We've discussed a lot of interesting themes so far, but there's a lot that remains to be built on and teased out from those. So even if you haven't read the novel, I'm sure there's a lot that you can play with, I suppose, and I'm sure Riya would be happy to answer those. So to move on to my next question, this is about the triad in the novel between love, loss, and healing. And oh, great. Okay, your video.
For now, if it goes back, if it gets bad, I'll just cut off the video again. But hi.
Sure.
Just a fair warning: I have dogs, so if they start up, just try to.
That's fine. Yeah. I think we would all be happy to see some dogs.
Yeah. Sure.
So my question is about the relationship between love, loss, and healing, because your protagonist, I think this is Meera, says something about love and loss at the outset. She says, let me confirm one thing now, because it's simply true. Love is only romantic when you've lost it or if you can't have it. And then equally in your novel, we see the opposite of that, because love also has a deep relationship with healing, because it's through sort of being in love with, it's through sort of the love between Meera, Sara, and Rahil that all of them heal in their own ways. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that relationship between love, loss, and healing that you explore in your novel.
Yeah, it's, there's something that my own learning throughout the thing is that we tend to measure love by loss, or how much loss we've experienced. We try to measure that. Like when you talk about an old love, that didn't pan out, it's all the more passionate. It's all the more, in that romanticized. And when you're in the moment of it, there's always, and of course in this book, there's a lot of conflict between the three of them, because it is an irregular relationship based on their societal context, and based on a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in the book. And therefore it is the emotions are always heightened in context to the power dynamics, the leverage one person can have on the other person, and the looming sense of I can't picture my life if I lose this, right? And I think that's what this kind of thought cycle is what allows us to romanticize a lot of ideas about how we consider love. And so I feel like, yeah, I think we define a lot of our feelings about romantic love in this way of how it didn't pan out, how it worked out. And it takes a different quality when you're in a long term, or when you're in a relationship, or when you're experiencing romantic love, and being in the moment. There's this other quality of healing that you talk about. It's usually in retrospect that you're like, oh yeah, this is what I learned, and this is how I'm healing. But also when you are in a more what can I say, non-dramatic, like things are just going really well in the thing, there's also nothing, there's no it's very hard to have a very angsty moment about it, but you possibly are healing a lot in other ways. But a lot of these these more palpable understandings about life, these all come from this inherent idea of how we measure love through loss, which I believe is which is probably the wrong way to go about it. But then that goes into the very definition of what love is and how we construct it.
Yeah, and just to speak to what you were saying about how what we fear about loss is how it changes our sense of and I mean subsequently what we fear about love as well as a result is how it changes our sense of ourselves and our futures. And certainly there is something about conventionally, I suppose, unfulfilled love, or a love that is non-heteronormative, that is non-monogamous, how those also change our understandings of our future, right? And
absolutely. I mean, I think it's our everything we've been raised on is very heteronormative, first of all. So anything that does not come to that measure is always like a something that's catches our radar in a heteronormative world. And most people are just like, oh well, that's odd, or that's you quickly put the label on it, and you either push it away, or you're just like, okay, whatever. But it's not seen in either you are either you get it or you don't, but there's no understanding of how have you come to this this thought understanding that something that is not heteronormative or not monogamous, why is that something that make your ears perk up? Why is it something that seems so abnormal or not in flow with the rest of things? And I mean, if you really go back to it, it's still the sense of how patriarchy has harmed all of us, every single human being, because it is lowered our collective imagination of what love can be. It has lowered our imagination of what living in fear is. And a lot of this book is also about how, as humans, we tend to live in this very fear-based energy. And when I say fear-based, and like everything is about, especially in India, right, with the added dogma and the added cultural expectations, there's always every decision we make is kind of fear-based. I have to do engineering because I have to get a job. I have, I have to marry within this community, otherwise somebody's going to get. Everything is very fear-based, and sometimes we don't even analyze how small those socializations actually add up and are actually controlling our lives and not allowing you to live.
Yeah. No, I really like what you said about patriarchy as having lowered our collective imagination of what love can be. I was just scribbling that down. Yeah. So let's move on to our next question. This is from Preeti. Mm-hmm. She says, could you please talk a bit about context, as in when we're reading about mental health, mostly in the context of Western lifestyle, mm-hmm. With most statistics being from there, how do we use the knowledge and experience to write and consolidate into a novel? How did you build the context for your novel? Did you face linguistic challenges or challenges of looking for sources or research that you could relate to?
Yes and no. That's a great question, Preeti. Thank you. I would so how I look at is that I look to the West in terms of being the front runners in transparency of personal experiences. That the vulnerability that they can show has been quite more apparent for the last few decades. India is now catching on, but within a certain lens, right? Because we're talking about the first of all the language of English, which has the global capital. So when you're talking about the rhetoric that we're reading in India, we are obviously reading it from a very privileged background, from a very there's a class interference there, that because we, people who are resonating with exactly what, say, the USA or the West has to say about mental health is usually of a certain class, because we can somehow lifestyle wise make some kind of associations with it. But even then, there are so many other cultural and subcultural issues that don't really account for the Indian experience at all. So like I said, like I would take the idea that the vulnerability showed, I think, in that way, a lot of American writers, especially in the personal memoir front and all that, they're quite unabashed with saying it how it is. And I think that is something very very powerful to take as a writer, to say this is what human experience can be, this is how they can feel. And this is really because they really say the thoughts that, in Indians are much more I mean, this is broad based blanket statement, but Indians are much more squirmish about sharing personal information, especially when it comes to the body and to sex and to relationships and things like that, right? We like anonymity. So in that way, if you can, understand the point that people are really thinking those thoughts, what you probably are thinking too, it's just that you're not seeing enough people within our context saying the same thing. But I can bet you they'll still resonate with, however absurd or bizarre you think, people have been in their life, in their experiences. So that's what I would use the context. But the other thing is for you to understand your own context of what you're trying to write about, who you're trying to write about, the environment and the cultural intersections that your characters, if you're writing fiction, are really going to be, impacted by. Because, when I was writing Meera, Sara, Rahul, they're very evidently comfortable urban people. They, Meera and Rahul are from interreligious marriages. They're half Hindu, half Muslim, but they've got obviously class privilege. And Meera obviously is from a, without me saying so, a lot of people can make the assumption that she is from an upper caste Hindu family. And so these are the intersections that you're going to have to understand, because that's how how they've created their worldview, and I think it's an important factor to consider. Otherwise we have a lot of myopia within our own country, because our country there's nothing that we can just call Indian, right? The spectrum is too wide.
And I mean, it's interesting because even in the West, again, like super homogenous category, but I think specifically just speaking about the US, because also as a result of being a post-colonial nation state, like most of our intellectual, I guess, heritage tends to be from England and America as a result of kind of the post-colonial complex, so to speak. But even in the US, for example, the whole idea that personal experience is indeed valuable knowledge, right? That it is a form of knowledge that ought to be taken seriously is something that the most marginalized had to fight for, right? Because when sort of these white and male Enlightenment thinkers, to them sort of rationality was the sort of the be all and end all. Again, to go back to the kind of mind-body split that was established by somebody like Descartes. But that it was, for example, Black women in the US who had to say that these are experiences, and how can we use this as the basis for revolutionary knowledge in some sense. So I do think there's a really interesting relationship between the personal and the political there.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Should we move on to our next question?
Sure, yes, please.
So, great. So my question, and this speaks to the question of context that Preeti asked. So what I find interesting about your novel is that, of course, you are creating context, but a lot of it feels larger than life. There's this constant sort of tussle between the mythical and the relatable in your novel. So, so the storyline is relatable insofar as, like, because you don't you're able to show them as complex people with complex whom we're all able to relate to. But then you'll have something like the rasagura, which is the fruit with which you open the novel. It's this mythical fruit that is only found in the city of Suryam, where all of them live. And so that's this otherworldly element that, sort of comes out of nowhere. And then similarly, you have Sarah, who is so human in her sort of vulnerability because of her illness, but equally she's this almost Sufi mystic,
Yeah.
right? And her world seems larger than life. So I was wondering, I guess, what did you want to do with those two elements of the mythical and the relatable, and why did you feel like that was important to do?
So when I was writing this, for some reason, first of all, I decided to make it a fictional Indian city. And I think the truth of the reason I did that was just not to make it Bangalore, because I'm from Bangalore and it would be the easiest thing to do. And yet a lot of people reading the book came and said, well, this sounds like Bangalore. But so when I had this fictional city, I want, how where you're from, something can sound really normal and everyday, but then somebody else from another city will be like, like how people ask, like, oh my God, the pollution must be so bad in Delhi, right? And or it's so cold there right now, or it's so hot there right now, and these are things that are like, maybe it's not something you might think about all the time, right? If your city is something but other people will find that really interesting. And that's kind of somehow the metaphor that I was trying to work with the rasagura fruit, which was like, sometimes something can exist and it can be just a part of people's life, and it might sound something that is completely irrational or weird or magical or impossible to other people. And a lot of the themes in this book, especially the relationship, a lot of people can even say that a relationship like this is impossible, or a relationship like this just goes against so many things, it's problematic, it has issues or whatever. But it is there for them, it was their normal, right? And I think that was I was hoping to get that metaphor across, that that people's experience are people's experience, and it's a lot more imaginative than you can conceive of from where you're sitting, because no matter what, everybody is still limited by their experiences and worldview. And once you jump ships and see that it's possible to live life in many different ways, then that just becomes your normal. So in a way, the body myth is both a myth and both reality at the same time, and that's what is like. And I wanted to keep that mythical quality to it, which is why, those worked as tools also.
Yeah. No, that's really great. And it's certainly an important perspective to think about when we engage with questions of difference, right? And as we try to find ways to do it, which is also the question of, you may not be able to relate to all of it, but that those two, sort of the relatable and that which is mythical in some sense, to your world anyway, coexist. When looking from the outside in. And so I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about writing. And I know that some of the people who may have joined us today could be budding writers. And I read something in one of your interviews, which I was really glad you spoke about. You had mentioned that this novel had come after 2 failed novels.
Yeah.
Which I think must have spanned like a year, 2 years. I don't know how long you were working on those other novels. But that it wasn't like you woke up one day, you wrote this book that did really well, but rather that it was this process of having to grow as a writer with your writing, with different subjects over time. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what the writing process was like for you, and some of the challenges that you may have faced there.
Yeah, so I've worked, in the last almost decade, I've worked with a lot of writing students because I do a lot of workshops, and I mostly take an entire class on rejection and the point of, knowing how essential that part is to being a writer. Because writing is, first of all, such a subjective thing. Even if even if your prose is on point and you think you've done something amazing and wonderful, it's still so subjective. And then there's other markers of marketing and how it'll fit in the global narrative right now and all of those things. But I actually started as a short story writer when I was 22. I'm 36 now, so it's been more than a decade of hardcore writing, seriously writing at 22. And I had this whole process of writing short stories and sending it out to literary magazines, collecting 5 million rejections, and keep going. And you hit a publication here, you hit a publication there, then suddenly you're like, oh wait, I can do this. And after a while, I had a collection of short stories. I published it with a very tiny micro press out of Singapore. But then, I was writing my first novel, and I realized I got to quite a bit of it too. I think it was like almost 3/4 done, when I realized it was too autobiographical. And this is the thing that most first-time writers kind of do, is like you're just writing from the imagination of yourself, and a lot of it is therapeutic because you're just trying to vomit out a lot of things that you faced in your life, and you're just trying to put characters to it and somehow make it a story. And I think it's a great, especially people who've had a lot of emotional things to process, or had harder younger lives. It's a great space for you to be able to kind of vomit out this stuff in a structured manner. But it very rarely makes your first novel. Because what you're doing is just getting started. You're just getting your idea of what is your worldview, yes, but then how much more can I imagine as a writer? And then that's where your voice starts to really develop and gets kind of imprinted. And so then I tried writing a second novel, and I thought, oh, this time I've got it, because it's completely different. It's got nothing to do with my life. It's got all these cool things going on. There's a character, and it's good to have 2 different timelines and blah blah blah. And I started writing it, and I got, the funny thing is, I got bored with it. I got exceptionally bored. And so after that, it bizarre. And I think I wrote The Body Myth at the oddest time. At the end of 2016, it just came to me, and it was just this intense 3 characters that were supposed to be there. And the first draft, which was actually a novella, not even the full book, came out of me in just a few months. It was something that just came out. But when I tell people this, they're like, oh wow. But I'm like, no, but there's like 11 years behind this.
Right.
11 years behind this. And so so that's really how it happened. And of course, everybody's journey is different, but persistence, rejection, and the idea that just because you have a cool idea it's not, because I've seen it slap me on my own face like 100 times, and I think I've done the coolest thing ever. It's like bam.
No, that's great to hear. And Meenakshi sends a message. She says, truthful expressions, so lovely to hear.
Oh, thank you, Meenakshi.
So, I think it is really helpful to share stories of some initial failure as traditionally.
Yeah. And it's not, and that's the best part, is like, I don't think you need to consider it as failure. It's an inevitable part of writing. Even now, after I've published a book, I still face rejections on my new writing. I still face a lot of pressure to write my next book, which doesn't just come like that just because you've written one book. So it's always a part of what's considering success. Now it's like maybe I'm not selling enough books. That becomes the success, right? Or like, are you actually being able to make some kind of sustainable career for yourself with, right? So there's always going to be something. So you have to just keep going, and as long as you're honest to your craft and your ability to take rejection, like nothing, you just, like a glass of water, you take rejection and you keep going, you'll get there.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to ask one last question, and this is also final call if anybody wants to send a question for Ria. So if there are no questions after this, we can wrap up. But if there are, please, oh, great. Somebody timed this incredibly well, stopped me mid-sentence. Anonymous says, what is the real fruit closest to Rasagura?
It's really funny because it was kind of inspired on my favorite fruit, which is the passion fruit.
Oh, I see that now.
Yeah, I guess right. Yeah. So it was kind of inspired on the passion fruit.
Okay, great. Okay, any more questions? Feel free to send them across. I'm going to ask Ria my final question. I found it so interesting that you said, and I honestly, maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, but I haven't heard anybody say, anybody who's like now a published writer say that they began writing at the age of 22. I think there's certainly a notion that, you know, if you are a writer whose book is published, does well or whatever, you would have started writing at a very early age, and you would have sort of been this prodigy straight out of the gate. And that you did serious writing from quite early on, right? Whereas, and so as a result of which, even your 20s seems like almost too late, right? At a time when kids, I mean, not kids, but teenagers are being, you know, published. So what would you say to people who may have, I don't want to say late bloomers, but who might have arrived late to the world of writing, and may sometimes feel discouraged by just the fact of having arrived after what seems to be the mainstream narrative?
So, you know, what's funny is that I think it's really important if you feel the call to be writing, because what makes you a writer, it's the need to write no matter what, okay, to express through what you write. And I feel like under our system, and I'm just going to go back to what you said about being 22 and not having anything before that, and I'll connect it. But there are people who are you know, have taken so long to unlearn so much of what they're supposed to be. And you know, in the workshops that I've taught, I've seen so many you know, people from IT and engineering backgrounds that are so talented in writing, and it's almost like you see it on their face during workshops, that they're like, oh, I could have done this. I could have taken this as a legit stream, or I could have taken this more seriously, not just as a hobby. And I feel like, you know, there are so many people with repressed talents and skills that they have to offer the world, that they were born with to nurture, that have been completely just socialized out of them, completely. And a lot of people find that calling later on. And why? Because age also allows you to have some perspective, right? So if you're lucky enough to realize that, yeah, this is something I want to do, then your age has got nothing to do with. All you is your persistence, and you're working on the craft, and you asking more questions and reading, and you know, somehow designing the way your words are going to get you. And to relate it to the thing about age, you said, you know, when I was a lot younger, I was so traumatized by the schooling system. It's not, you know, one of my fourth grade teachers did tell my mom that this one's going to be a writer, because of a small weird ghost story I wrote. It made no sense, but it was just one of those things. And but that was something, I mean, my mom told me that, and then I forgot about it for the rest of my thing. And I, you know, I always, and I'm also, you know, someone who is dyslexic and can't spell, so my career is dependent on spell check, right? So I mean, all of these things, especially when you're younger, are you know, things that you might think that there's no way you can ever be use that as a prominent force. So it was only later that, you know, I thought, okay, I'm going to write. Even at 22, even then I didn't really think anything was going to come out of it. But then, you know, that learning and that persistence, it just adds up.
Okay, great. This has been awesome. I think we all learned a lot today about, I guess, just unlearning oughts and rethinking what we've been told not to do. So I'm really glad you joined us. So thank you so much, Ria, and thank you everyone else who made it for today's session. If you have any feedback on this session or any of the other ones that we do, feel free to write to me on manjari@belong with 2gs.net, or contact@belong again with 2gs.net. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully I will see you soon. We have a session tomorrow with Rana Safvi, the author, historian, translator, and she's going to be reading tales from the Quran and Hadith. So feel free to join us for that at 11:30 tomorrow, if that's something that interests you. Anything, last words, Ria?
No, thank you so much, Manjari. I loved answering all the questions. The questions were so thoughtful. And thank you to all the attendees who came over here and even asked questions. Really enjoyed talking today. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, see you all soon. Thank you so much for coming. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.